Hello again. We will be continuing Chapter 3 and software vulnerabilities this week, and we will conclude with these and then move on to operating systems security. So it's going to be a week of two topics. There's also going to be two quizzes to take because we have this second part of Chapter 3 from the textbook, which is still on software vulnerabilities and malware and things along those lines that I will be talking with in the next couple of videos. And then there's going to be a third video on operating system security that there will be a short quiz on that one as well. So with that being said, let me not forget the t-shirt of the day. This week is Cyber Defense team week because we have a virtual cyber defense competition on Wednesday and Thursday. And sadly, the local Palmetto Cyber Defense competition, which I'm wearing the shirt for, has been cancelled. But this t-shirt is from 2018 when we had won the second place. So I think we can get this again. And that's why the t-shirt of the week is themed from cyber defense competitions. So let's move on to the class material with discussion about malware. One of the most well-known terms from computer security. Even non-computer science people know about malware because it's so common way to infect a user's computer. Malware is malicious software with goal to either extract information from a computer or delete it or do different type of destructive operations. And as we can see, there's different types of malware as listed in this slide. There's worms that are specific types of malicious software that copy themselves. We call this worm propagation. There's different models for worm propagation that are borrowing terms from biological models like the SIR model for virus infection, where S stands for susceptible, I for infected, R for recovered. And worm propagation is very interesting because a worm could propagate as far as the whole internet. I have done some research in worm propagation between Internet of Things devices, which is kind of more difficult because they're not very standardized as PCs are. And a very interesting thing to look into because worms can be extremely destructive. What they do is they sit in a computer and scan around for similar vulnerabilities and they infect other computers. Now, viruses are pretty well known. They can replicate themselves and pass their malicious code. And this is the most well-known type of malware, a virus. On the other hand, Trojan horses are possibly benign software, like let's say a video game that you find for free, that inside it could have malicious extensions that are not apparent. The name Trojan horse, of course, is taken by the Trojan Wars, where the Greeks tricked the Trojans with a horse, and they entered. They kept some soldiers over there, so that's how they took over the Trojans. So that's why they say, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." And that's about it. The biggest thing with Trojan horses is mail. Trojans that propagate through emails, and that's a pretty well-known way or a vector of infecting devices. Ransomware is pretty well known nowadays. It's one of the most common and mostly heard malware software types, and ransomware, as you probably have heard, is a malicious software that infects a device and encrypts the files in this device. It could infect a personal device or enterprise servers and things along those lines. And the thing with ransomware, the special characteristic of this malware is that the adversaries that install it and manage it could return the files, the computer files, to their original state, could decrypt those with a certain amount of ransom, after a certain amount of ransom is getting paid to them. And we have a lot of examples of ransomware that have reached the news. Even big universities have been attacked by this type of ransomware all around the world, actually. In the US, we have a couple of very known cases of ransomware, such as the Atlanta ransomware case that took down a lot of systems in Atlanta, and the people of Atlanta had to go back to paper. They couldn't use parking, airport parking, cashiers and things like that, because the malware had taken this over. There's several local governments that have gotten ransomware, and unfortunately many of them have paid the ransom because they didn't have proper backups and proper procedures to restore their data. So that's pretty detrimental, and it's better to have, of course, a good procedure to back up your information than to pay this kind of ransoms. The last type of malware is one of the most irritating ones. It's called spyware, and actually it's pretty common, and almost all of us have gotten it in our computers. I know I have. And this type of malware is spying on what you're doing, and it may be the biggest goal of spyware is to force you to browse specific things, or get you to specific sites, or click on advertisements and things like that. Interesting to look back and learn from the history of malware. I have a really good infographic in this slide that I encourage you to look into. The first malware that we know of appeared in the 1980s, mid-1980s, 1986. It was called Pakistani Brain, and it was using the boot sector of floppy disks, which you probably have never seen floppy disks, but even though this is a really old medium, you gotta think that we still use ways of infecting, such as USB drives. So even though the floppy disk does not exist anymore, the methodology of infecting via a storage medium still exists, very much so. I was just listening to a podcast that was talking about a scam that was sending thumb drives to people together with Best Buy cards, and saying that this gift card you can only get if you put this thumb drive in your computer to see what gifts you can get from Best Buy. So, and through, of course, that USB drive, there was malware that was infecting the computers. So, learning from the past. Pakistani Brain, first malware infecting through floppy disks, boot sectors of floppy disks. Now, one of the most well-known malwares and early malware software is the Morris worm that was developed by Robert Morris Jr., actually. Who is interestingly the son of a former NSA scientist. Was called NCSC at the time, but I think it's the equivalent of NSA. And so this guy was a student at MIT. Back then at 1988, we had this initial very small internet. And with his worm that was self-propagating, through BSD and Sun operating systems, he infected the whole known internet at the time, which of course was not that big, but it was quite detrimental at the time and all that. And the interesting thing was that it was mainly an experiment. He didn't understand the extent of what he was doing. And then there's more in this infographic that you can look into. I'm just looking at the most well-known ones. There's a very huge set of strings in the early 2000s, late 90s. We start with the Melissa worm that was spreading through Microsoft Outlook. So these malware softwares are infecting mostly Windows, as you will see in the 90s and early 2000s. But that doesn't mean that Linux and Mac do not get infected as well. It's just that they're not as targeted. So Melissa was a worm that was spreading from Outlook email clients. Then we have the love letter, or the I love you malware as we knew it back then. I remember these two. I was an undergrad student at the time, so they were getting very, very well known and interesting to study. So the I love you virus would disguise as a love letter. And it would access your operating system, your software, your storage, and things like that. So not a very loving virus. So Nimda, another pretty well-known worm that was, because it was 2001 when it appeared, attributed to Al-Qaeda, but never proven. One of the most well-known ones appeared in 2003 and kept infecting Microsoft SQL servers. It was called the SQL Slammer, self-replicating packet, actually, that would take advantage of the Microsoft SQL server. Very destructive for enterprise and networks that had these servers. And it slowed down the whole internet at the time, which was very interesting. My Doom is a pretty well-known one. And again, it was based on email type of worm, and caused denial of service. Then one of the most well-known ones that we still see it around is Configure, appearing in 2008. It spread really, really widely. We still see its traces in internet, darknet, black holes and all that even now. And then one of the most interesting ones that you could write a book or make a movie for is Stuxnet, the first military malware, a worm actually, that infected Iranian nuclear facilities and their SCADA controllers, causing them to show that the factory was working perfectly when it was actually going through an almost nuclear type of attack. So a very malicious, very bad malware. And the list goes on. We even talked about the Mirai worm, which was a purely Internet of Things type of malware. So now one of the terms that is really important to understand from this slide is what we call a zero-day. A zero-day is malware that we just discovered today, but it has been active. So if we discover some active malware that is infecting, let's say, Windows machines today, but it's been infecting them for a while, today is the 0 day that we found it, and there's probably not patch for something like that. Enterprise malware, as I have gone through the history of it, like the SQL Slammer worm, which was completely enterprise, it wouldn't infect PCs, it would infect servers, SQL servers, has been on the rise, and still, because it can earn a lot of money to the adversaries that spread this. And finally, nowadays, mobile malware is the thing, especially in markets like the Android market, that is not as restrictive as the iOS market. There is a lot of mobile malware, and one needs to be careful of what applications they are downloading. Now, again, this cannot get earn as much money to an adversary as enterprise malware, but it can be quite destructive for a user if passwords are stolen or bank accounts and things along those lines that we do nowadays with our phone. So what are the features of malware? First, the feature and goal of malware is to cause harm, of course, but there could be non-destructive type of harm that it could do, like, put irritating backgrounds on a computer or something like that. That's non-destructive. Destructive is to encrypt all your data and you have no access to it. Then there's commercial or criminal intent, and also there could be world harm intentions if it's state actors that are using this type of malware. And the big thing with malware is that it's also very difficult to estimate how much it can harm us. And that's pretty bad. We know that it causes millions of dollars or billions of dollars, some say, of damage, but it's very hard to determine, and it can be quite detrimental. Now, there's malware that is not yet activated, so there needs to be activation, so it may be a sleeper type of malware and all that. And there's also stealth. So a feature of malware can be that it's stealth, that it goes completely undetected, runs in the background, and does its malicious work. Now, this is a diagram from your book, chapter 3, that shows how malware can hide in an original program. Specifically, that could be also a Trojan that is shown over here, where virus code is multiplexed with the original software. And in this case, you have a modified program that works as expected, like let's say it's an Excel spreadsheet that also has some malicious features that extract information from your computer or delete files or encrypt files or something like that. This is exactly how a lot of ransomware is being transmitted, actually. An Excel spreadsheet with some embedded code behind it that will encrypt all your files, and then the perpetrators are asking for ransom to decrypt those. So there could the transmission can also happen with an installer or with, like I said, different software like an Excel spreadsheet. But of course, as I mentioned before, with actual hardware mediums like a USB drive, and of course via the internet. The internet is a fantastic way to transmit malware. The interesting thing about malware is how it gets activated. So we just talked about transmission, and now we're going to see activation. So a malware software could be activated only once or repeatedly, depending. So usually spyware is activated repeatedly, whereas ransomware only once, encrypt, done. Here you can see how in the file directory that has actual data, there could be overwriting with the virus data, and this round figure is a hard disk, and it's actually referring to an actual hard disk drive and not an SSD that doesn't spin. So this is a spinning disk drive, which they're still spinning disk drives nowadays. So it could overwrite legitimate software, or it could change pointers. If you've done some C programming, you could see that it's very easy with C programming to just manipulate a pointer in memory, or as we talked last week about buffer overflow, just manipulate a pointer in memory and point to where your malicious software is, and then that will be executed. So that's how malware can be activated. So buffer overflow is a way to activate, actually, by pointing the memory address and the execution of the program to a specific point where there's malicious code. That is a way to activate malware. Finally, an oldies but goodies type of way of activating malware is to put it in the boot sector of your operating system. I do remember that it was a very popular way of activating malware back in the day when I was an undergrad student, but nowadays it's too complex and too much to implement. So another picture from your book, another diagram from your book that shows before and after infection, how the booting sequence may look like. And we conclude with the last feature of malware, which is stealth, which means how quiet it is when it's being installed, for example. So it may go completely undetected while it's being installed, or it could be stealth during execution. I don't know if you ever do this on your computer, for example, but I, every once in a while, open my activity manager on my Mac and I see so many processes and I'm like, which one is legit and which one is malware? I wonder. So, and that's part of stealth features, the stealth features of malware. It could be that it's so invisible that you cannot see it during execution, or it can look stealth as it's being stored in your file system. It looks the same, your file system looks the same, or it could be obscured using steganography and things like that, like you've seen also in the competition. So that concludes a thorough review of malware. In the next video, we will review ways to defend from malicious software and also weaknesses in software.